Hang on. Good afternoon, officer. What can I do for you?
I noticed you completely ignored that one-way sign back there.
But officer, I was only going one way. Look, I gotta get home before my neighbor does. There's a couple things I need to get out of his garage. Can I go, please?
I don't think you get how this works. Do you even understand why I pulled you over?
I don't know. Is it all the stolen lumber in the trunk?
What?
My neighbor called you, didn't he?
Can you step out of the vehicle, please?
That costume that you get to wear is so neat. My good friend Ethan is a deputy sheriff, and he recently asked me if I could build him a stand for all of his gear. And I said sure. So I started off by designing something that could hold his bulletproof vest and his duty belt. Yep, I said duty. There'd be a tray to hold his radio, his body cam, and some donuts, and an opening in the back for all of the charging cables. And to the right of it, a decorative lockbox to hold his pistol as well as his taser. And another cool thing about this design is that the entire stand can break down into 3 parts so that it can be moved easily. All right, let's see if I can actually make this thing. The first thing I do is I slide on my steel-toed safety shoes and I pick out some black walnut to use for this project. Once I had all the boards that I thought I'd need, I could map out where I could get each piece from, and then cut them all down to a more manageable size over at the miter saw. And since some of these boards are so long, I had to deploy the wings on my mobile miter station so that I'd have the support to do it. Now, many of these boards had a little warp, a twist, or a cup to them, so I had to shim them up on a sled so that they didn't rock back and forth. Then at that point, I could run them through the planer and make the tops of them perfectly flat. And once I got one side looking good, I could remove them from the sled, flip them over, and flatten the other face. After a while, I had a bunch of perfectly flat boards. The jointer let me put one square edge on each board, and then I could put a second clean edge on each one over at the table saw. And then I took a moment to jot down each part of my body where I still need to lose weight. Then with all the pieces rough cut, I could start working on the inlay on the post. Now I originally was going to inlay the name Policey McCopperface, but it turned out to be too long, so I fell back on the idea to just put in his last name. I let the CNC route out the mortises for the letters, and then to also cut out the letters themselves, and I did it from some high contrasting hard maple. I popped out the letters, I cleaned up each one, and then I could glue them in and seat them all the way down into their mortises with some taparoos. Once it was dry, I could take it over to the bandsaw and nip off the bits that were still standing proud. Now you might be wondering why I made the letters so thick to begin with. Well, it wasn't my intention, but once you see the outtakes at the end of the video, you'll understand why I had to. Next up was making all the panels. I would orient the various boards in a way where they looked nice, and then just mark the layout once I had them in that position. Then with a little bit of glue and a lot of bit of clamps, I could make up the panels and then set them off to the side to dry. Once they were out of the clamps, I could sand off any squeeze out and then trim them down to size over at the miter saw and the table saw. A few of the panels got some roundovers, so I took care of that over at the router table. You'll notice that when routing the end grain, I go backwards just a tiny bit on the end first. This helps eliminate tear out, and it also makes it look like I know what I'm doing. Now I can tilt the blade in my table saw and get to work cutting in the miters for the post. Once I had all 4 pieces cut, I could glue them up. Now clamping up something like this would be really tough, so I opted for the blue tape technique to join them all together. Basically, I just taped up each of the seams really tight. I flipped it over, added some glue, and then rolled the whole thing up like a burrito. Then with a few more pieces, I could secure it closed and then leave it to dry. And then when it did dry, I could cut it down to size over at the miter saw. Next up was cutting and mitering all the pieces for the tray and the lockbox. Then, since it worked so well before, I used the same tape technique to glue them up as well. And why not do it a third time for each of the post mortises? Then I took a moment to jot down what you're probably thinking about this video so far. Now, since each of the post mortises will likely experience some lateral torque, I didn't want them blown apart. So, to keep that from happening, I used my spline jig and I made a bunch of cuts at the corners. While I was at it, I decided to do the same thing for the tray and the lockbox as well. Then, using my thin strip jig, I cut down some pieces that would fit snugly into each one of those cuts. Once I had a few that were just the right size, I could divide them into little splines over the bandsaw and then glue each one of them in place into the various pieces. When they were dry, I could cut off the majority of the splines that stuck out and then just sand the rest of it smooth until they disappeared. The post mortise pieces got a decorative chamfer on their edges, along with the big base panel too. So I took care of that over at the router table, and then I was ready to fasten them together. I carefully centered it exactly onto the base. I traced it, and then drilled out the mounting holes. Then I could flip the piece over, and then countersink those holes. I spread some glue on the bottom edge, and then gently sat it in place and weighted it down to dry. And once it had, I just drilled out the mounting holes a bit deeper and then added some screws for some additional strength. I nearly forgot to add the spot in the tray for all the charging cables to go through, so luckily I could still cut that on the table saw. And once I got that created, I could round over the edges with my little trim router. Then both the tray and the lockbox got glued down onto their bases. And as any woodworker would do in this case, I used a giant stack of black walnut to weigh them down until they were dry. And when they were dry, I could glue the tray down onto the platform that sits on top of the post. Next, I could start making the brackets to hold the vest and the belt. I used a dado stack to make the indentations, and then I used a pocket hole jig to drill out some mounting holes for some screws. Now, I know that pocket holes aren't all that pretty to look at, but since I'm a self-proclaimed evil genius, I came up with an idea to address this. I designed some neat-looking corbels on the computer, and then I had the CNC machine cut them out for me. I added a small round over to the edges, and then I spent the better half of a life sentence sanding each one of them to get them absolutely perfect. I glued, clamped, and screwed on each of the brackets, and then to cover the pocket holes as well as to add additional support to each of them, I glued on the corbels and clamped them up real tight to dry. And this worked perfect. Then to dress up the base a bit, I made some nice looking molding on the router table, and then I trimmed around the bottom mortise piece. Now it was time for me to start working on the blue line flag inlay. Now I've never done anything like this before, so I was really trying to just kind of figure it out as I went along. I first started by having the CNC cut out just a single flag stripe. Then I mixed up enough epoxy to fill a swimming pool so that I could make a tiny blue line. I told you, for me, this was the first time doing anything like this, so it's not surprising that I screwed up the ratios and ended up with so much leftover epoxy. But it's all good. I just ended up using the leftovers to save my neighbor from getting any more junk mail by epoxying his mailbox closed. I used a heat gun to pop the bubbles, and then I just let things sit for a day to fully cure. Now the next step was to have the CNC cut out the rest of the flag, all the rest of the stripes, and all the stars in the union too. Once that was done, I could mix up a bunch of black epoxy and then fill in all the rest of the flag. Now when that fully cured, I could flatten things out and reveal the finished product. I sanded up through all the various micro mesh grits to get a really nice finish on it. And then I could carve out the mortise and the lockbox top for this to be placed into. Now I thought it would look really neat if I let the flag sit proud just a tiny bit and then put a small chamfer around the top edges. Then I spread some glue around the inside and I dropped it in place. Next up was hinges. I used a razor to trace the hinge locations, and then I could use a router to remove the bulk of the material. Then came some chisel work. I chopped around the outside and then gently pared away the inside until I had the hinge fitting perfectly flush. Drilled out the mounting holes, and then I could attach it onto the box. Then I realized I was an idiot and I completely forgot to install the lock, so I had to take it back off of the box and make the hole on the drill press. Then I put the lid back on and I got the lock installed. Then I glued in a tiny catch for it to lock against. I took this tiny chain off my neighbor's ceiling fan and I figured it would be perfect for holding the lockbox lid when it was open. And of course, I put it on using some super tiny flathead screws. The whole thing gets glued onto the top platform, and then I can perform a misdemeanor and vandalize the bottom with my logo. For a finish, I decided to go with Odie's oil because it's super simple to apply and it really brings out that rich dark tone of the walnut. I just used a little Scotch-Brite scrubbing pad thingy and I buffed it into the wood. I let it sit overnight to fully absorb, and then the next day I just used a soft rag to wipe off any excess. Then it's ready to go. The last thing I do is I put the three pieces together. I drop the post down into the base, and then I set the top piece right down onto it. Now I can let my buddy Ethan have a look and see what he thinks. Alright, so check this thing out.
Now that's awesome. That is sweet.
He's darn right it's awesome. This thing turned out amazing. The chamfered edges and all the miters turned out super sharp and crisp. The inlay of his name adds a wonderful personal touch, and it just turned out so nice. The corbels hide the pocket holes perfectly, plus they look fantastic and they add additional strength to the brackets. The walnut has some amazing figure and it just turned out gorgeous. But the cherry on top was just how nice the epoxy flag turned out. It really stands out and it just adds so much to the whole piece. Alright, let's see how it works. Alright, throw your belt on there. That's perfect.
Yeah, that's perfect.
So then your vest, it just kind of hooks right on here through the neck hole, like that, and then it can hang just like that. Doesn't that look good?
That's awesome. Yeah, my radio, my body cam, stuff like that, that'll all fit in here just perfect. It's enough space. Charging cords are just going right there. And
oh, your flashlight too, right?
Yep, I can throw my flashlight in here, kind of in the corner, or even lay it down. Throw all my belt keepers in there too, and
perfect.
Everything should fit.
Nice. I love how easy this lock operates too. It's so smooth. Locked and open.
I can set that in there.
Is there enough room in here for your taser as well?
Yeah, it's deep enough. If I even have to stand it up, won't reach the top, or I could just lay it down, it still won't reach the top.
Nice. Perfect. Overall, it really did turn out good, and he seems to really like it, so maybe he won't arrest me now. Hey, if you enjoyed the video and you feel I've earned it, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave the video a like and maybe even a comment down below. I've got lots of other videos that I'm sure you'll enjoy as well. And if you'd like to try making one of these gear stands for yourself, or as a gift, or even a sell, I have detailed step-by-step plans available for this on my website over at fishersshoponline.com. Well, I think that's it for this one. Thanks so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Come out. What the heck? Oh gosh, what is going on with this? Yes. Oh crap. Oh crap. Okay, we'll try it again. Oh my gosh. Ugh, get off of there. What can I do for you? What can I do for you? What can I do? What in the world was that? When it was all done carving, it didn't raise up all the way. And then when it was going back to the home position, it just dragged this bit right through my letters and snapped off. What would have caused that? Computers are dumb. What did I do? Made it. Perfect.